Hine matovu manai, sheverachim gam yachad. 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 Hine matovu manai, sheverachim gam yachad.
Shabbat Shalom. Good evening, good Shabbos. Welcome to Congregation Dor Tamid in our Friday evening Kabbalat Shabbat worship service. It is great to see you all tonight as we welcome in this Shabbat together, as we come together on this Shabbat to take a step back, to rest, renew, refresh. For many of us to celebrate Simchas this weekend, as we will talk about in just a little while, with the Rothenberg family and Jason celebrating becoming a bar mitzvah tomorrow. But this Shabbat is Shabbat Acharei Mot. It's the Shabbat where we read the Parsha Acharei Mot in the Torah, meaning after the death. Specifically, the Torah refers to after the death of Aaron's sons and how he responded and how the people responded. But for all of us, it is Shabbat Acharei Mot. It is the Shabbat immediately following Yom HaShoah, Holocaust Remembrance Day, which we will mark in a little while in our service, hearing from and learning from my teacher, Professor Simo, who will join us virtually, and I will introduce her more formally later in the service and through psalms and prayers of memory. But it is first and foremost Shabbat. As the poet Achad Ha'am taught, Shabbat is not only do the Jewish people keep Shabbat, but more importantly, Shabbat has kept the Jewish people. And so we enter into Shabbat this week with a moment of breath, a moment of grace, a moment of gratitude that we are all here together as one community. There's a lot of new faces in the sanctuary. So for those of you who are in the sanctuary, just take a moment, find someone you don't know and say hello. Each week on Shabbat, as we enter into this holy time, and even though the sun is setting later and later, we still have the benefit or the luck of being able to extend Shabbat, to extend our time of Shabbat together by bringing light into creation at its outset. So I'm going to ask Jason to come forward along with his family, his brothers, his mom, and his dad, so that they can kindle our Sabbath lights as we all turn to page 120. It wouldn't be a Shabbat at CDT without candle issues, so it's okay.
And we join together. Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kiddushanu b'mitzvotav, v'tzivanu lehadlikneh shel Shabbat. Shabbat Shalom.
Page 124, we read responsibly. May the door of this synagogue be wide enough to receive all who hunger for love, all who are lonely for friendship. May the door of this synagogue be narrow enough to shut out pettiness and pride, envy and enmity. May it be too high to admit complacency, selfishness, and harshness. We begin our service of Kabbalat Shabbat, our service of welcoming Shabbat on page 130.
V'chuliranen al Adonai, Narielo etzur yishenu, Mikadma panav b'toda, Bizmirot Narielo. Shiru l'Adonai kol haaretz. Shiru l'Adonai shir chadash. Shiru l'Adonai kol haaretz. Shiru l'Adonai shir chadash. Sing unto God all the earth a new song. I will sing unto God a new song. Sing unto God and we'll all sing along. All the earth a new song unto God. Shiru l'Adonai kol haaretz. Shiru l'Adonai shir chadash. Shiru l'Adonai kol haaretz. Shiru l'Adonai shir chadash.
We turn now to page 138 as we prepare to welcome in the Sabbath bride with the singing of the Chadodi. We will sing together tonight verses 1, 2, 5, and 9. For the ninth and final verse, we rise and face the door of the sanctuary, hoping to catch a glimpse of the Sabbath bride as she enters our presence.
L'chadodi likrat kala, b'nei Shabbat nekabela. 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 Shamor v'zachor b'dibor echad, Ishmi anu el hamyukat, Adonai echad u'shemo echad, L'shem u'tiferet v'litila. Lecha, lecha, dodi, dodi, lecha, dodi, likrat kala, b'nei Shabbat nekabela. Lecha, dodi, likrat kala, b'nei Shabbat nekabela. Likrat Shabbat lechu v'nelcha, ki mekor habracha, merosh mikedem nisucha, sof ma'aseh b'machshava tehila. Lecha, lecha, dodi, dodi, lecha, dodi, likrat kala, b'nei Shabbat nekabela. Lecha, dodi, likrat kala, b'nei Shabbat nekabela. Toreri, toreri, iba ore kubi, uri, shetaberi, kibod Adonai alai iknikva. Lecha, dodi, lecha, dodi, likra, kala. B'nei Shabbat nekabela, lecha, dodi, likra, kala. B'nei Shabbat nekabela. Oli v'shalom materet ba'ala, gam b'simcha u'v'tzola, toch emunei am segula, boi kala, lecha, lecha, dodi, lecha, likra kala, b'nei Shabbat nekabela, lecha, likra kala, b'nei Shabbat nekabela.
Please be seated. We continue on page 140 with Psalm 92, a psalm for the Sabbath day. Mizmor shir liyom haShabbat, tov le'odot l'Adonai, u'zamer l'shimcha el yom, la'agid ba'boker chasdecha, ve'emunatcha ba'lelot. It is good to praise Adonai, to sing hymns to your name, O Most High, to proclaim your steadfast love at daybreak, your faithfulness each night, with a 10-string harp, with voice and lyre together. You've gladdened me by your deeds, Adonai. I shout for joy at your handiwork. How great are your works, Adonai, how very subtle your designs. A brute cannot know, a fool cannot understand this. Together, the righteous bloom like a date palm. They thrive like a cedar in Lebanon. Planted in the house of Adonai, they flourish in the courts of our God. In old age, they still produce fruit. They are full of sap and freshness, attesting that Adonai is upright, my rock in whom there is no wrong. So we prepare now to transition into our evening service with the Shema and its blessings. I'd like to invite our Bar Mitzvah, Jason Rothenberg, to the Bima to lead us in the Chatzah Kaddish on page 144.
Yikada, Vikada, Shmei Rabba,
Amen.
Be'alma divrachir teviam lichmachute, Bechaye chonu yomechon, Uchaye zecho Beit Yisrael, Bagala, Uvizman Kariv, Nimeru, Amen, Yeheshmei Rabba Mevorach, Le'olam Maya, Yiparach, Yishtabach, Yipa'ar, Vichaman, Vinaseh, Vitadar, Vitaled, Vitalal, Shmei Kedusha, Berichu, Le'elamin, Kober Chata, Beshirata, Shushvechata,
V'nechemata, na'amiran be'alma, v'yimberu.
Amen.
Am I awake? Am I prepared? Are you listening to my prayer? Can you hear my voice? Can you understand? Am I awake? Am I prepared? Baruch hu et Adonai Amorah, Baruch Adonai Amorah, Le'olam va'ed, Le'olam va'ed. Yalla lai lai lai, yalla lai lai lai, yalla lai lai lai. Yalla lai lai lai, yalla lai lai lai, yalla lai lai lai. Am I awake? Am I prepared?
Please be seated. Page 148. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam. Asher bidbaro ma'ariv arabim b'chokma potach sharim. Uvitbuna mishanei itim u'machalif et hazmanim. U'misader ha'kochavim b'mishmeroteim barakia kirtzona. Praise to you, Adonai our God, from whom the evening flows. Your wisdom sets the way on which time and season glide. Your breath guides the sail of the stars, creator of the tide of time and light. You guide the current of day into night. As heaven spans to infinity, you set its course for eternity. Praise to you, Adonai our God, from whom the evening flows. Baruch atah Adonai, ha'ma'ariv arabim. As we turn now in our prayer books to page 152, for the words of the Shema, I invite everyone to take a moment and close your eyes. The Shema teaches us we need to listen. Listen to those around us. Listen to the voices speaking to us. Be open to one another. Be open to holiness in the world, but also to listen within ourselves. To listen to that still small voice within, the voice of holiness, the voice of godliness, the voice of oneness. So we listen.
Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. Ve'achait Adonai Elohecha, b'chol levavcha u'b'chol nafshecha, u'b'chol me'odecha. Ve'hayu advarim ha'ele asher anochi mitzavecha hayom al levavecha v'shinantam levanecha v'dibarta bam v'shivtecha v'veitecha u'v'lechtecha v'aderech u'v'shoftecha u'v'kumecha u'kshartam le'ot al yadecha V'hayu l'totafot beinenecha, uchtavtam al mezuzot beitecha u'visharecha, lema'an tizkeru v'asitem et kol mitzvotai, v'yitem kedoshim le'elohechem. Ani Adonai Elohechem, asher hotzeiti etchem, Me'eretz Mitzrayim, liot lachem Elohim, ani Adonai Elohechem, Adonai Elohechem, emet.
We turn now to page 157 as we read responsively. In a world torn by violence and pain, a world far from wholeness and peace, give us the courage to say, Adonai, there is one God in heaven and earth. From bondage in Egypt, we were delivered. At Sinai, we bound ourselves to your way. Though our failings are many and our faults are great, it has been our glory to bear witness to our God, keeping alive in dark ages your vision of a world redeemed.
Yai lai 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 lai.
Yai lai 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 lai.
Yai lai 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 lai. Yai lai lai lai. Mi kamocha ba'en limadonai. Mi kamocha neder b'kodesh. Mi kamocha ba'en limadonai. Mi kamocha neder b'kodesh. Nora. Osei Nora Osei Adonai Imloch le'olam va'ed Yai lai 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 lai
Yai lai lai lai.
Yai lai 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 lai. Baruch Ata Adonai Ka'al Yisrael.
Page 161.
Let there be love and understanding among us. Let peace and friendship be our shelter from life's storm. Let there be love and understanding among us. Let peace and friendship be our shelter from life's storm. Ashkivenu, Adonai Eloheinu. Ashkivenu, Leshalom. Leha'amidenu, Shomrenu, Lekayim. Ubrosalenu, Sukat Shlomecha, Ashkivenu, Adonai Eloheinu, Ashkivenu, Leshalom. Let there be love and understanding among us. Let peace and friendship be our shelter from life's storm.
We turn now to page 162 for these words of Torah that remind us that as we keep Shabbat, it will keep us as well and renew our souls.
Shamru b'nei Yisrael et ha-Shabbat la'asot et ha-Shabbat ledorotam berit olam. Shamru b'nei Yisrael et ha-Shabbat la'asot et ha-Shabbat ledorotam berit olam. Beini uvein b'nei Yisrael Oti leolam, Oti leolam, Veshamru b'nei Yisrael et ha-Shabbat, la'asot et ha-Shabbat ledorotam berit olam. Isheshet yamim asa Adonai et ha-shamayim, ואת הארץ ושמרו בני ישראל את השבת לעשות את השבת לדורותם ברית עולם. וביום השביעי שבת וינפש, שבת וינפש, שבת וינפש. ושמרו בני ישראל את השבת לעשות את השבת לדורותם ברית עולם.
It's great because Micah comes running in from the hallway at the first chord every Shabbos. Page 164, we turn to the tefillah and we rise together for our central prayer section of the service. We will sing the opening psalm together, and then each of us can continue in our own time, in our own way, throughout the section of the prayer service, using the words on the page and the words that we hold in our hearts and minds. And we will conclude with a prayer for peace.
Yalla lai lai lai, yalla lai lai lai. Yalla lai lai lai, 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 yalla lai lai lai. Adonai sefatai kita, ufi agid dehilatecha. Adonai, open up my lips, that my mouth may declare your praise. La 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 la, la 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 la, la 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 la, la la la. Oh, say shalom, Roma. Oh, say shalom, Roma. Ase, ase shalom. Ase shalom. Ase shalom. Alleluia. 1, 2, 3, 4. May the one who makes peace bring peace down, bring peace down. May the one who makes peace bring peace down, bring peace down. May the one who makes peace bring peace down, bring peace down. May the one who makes peace bring peace down, bring peace down. Oh, say shalom. Be Roma, oh, say shalom. Be Roma, Uyase, shalom. Uyase, shalom. Uyase, shalom. Hallelujah. 1, 2, 3, 4. May the one who makes peace bring peace down, bring peace down. May the one who makes peace bring peace down, bring peace down. May the one who makes peace bring peace down, bring peace down. May the one who makes peace bring peace down, bring peace down.
We are in the period of our calendar called the Omer. It's the 7 days or 7 weeks of 7 days from Pesach until Shavuot. These days that we count from Exodus, from our leaving Egypt until Revelation at Sinai on Shavuot. And it is a mitzvah to count the Omer each day. So we're going to turn to page 570, and in a moment we're going to count the Omer together. Now, it is a tradition to not announce the days of the Omer until we actually said the bracha, the blessing, but just a hint that yesterday was the 13th day of the Omer. So today would be whatever it is, yes. So we turn to page 570 and we rise to count the Omer. Hineni mukhan zuman kayem mitzvat aseh shel sfirat haomer. Together, I am ready to fulfill the mitzvah of counting the omer. Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu al sfirat haomer. Our praise to you, Adonai, sovereign of all, who hallows us with your mitzvot, commanding us to count the omer. Hayom arba'a asar yom shehem shnei shavuot la'omer. Today is 14 days, which is 2 weeks of the Omer. Please be seated. In our service, and we take a moment to think of those members of our community who are ill. Some are at home recovering, some are in the hospital. Some have diseases and illnesses from which they may never recover. This week, we think especially of Marty Duke, Marty Barish, Gary Paul, Brian Berger, Chandler Jacobs, Dory Korn, Rita Jonas, Hugh Hadwin, Harriet Jacobs, Renee Kahn, Susan Abrams, Yael Bat David Vilea, Bev Mahone, Sylvia Kirsch, Alan Friedman, Sarah Kahn, Lee Silverstein, Jill Vantine, Eleanor Goodman, Lily Makovich, Libby Routman, Laurel Phoenix, Marjorie Whitmore, Jerry Phillips, Claire Levin, Paul Kershon, Rita Fisher, Leslie Knight, Bert Singerman, Stephen Schiff, Mateo Velasquez, Max Jacobs, Kathy Walden, Richard Zuspin, Christopher Denton, Phyllis Lathan, and Larry Futterman. If you are thinking of someone who is in need of a prayer of healing, I invite you to share their name with the community as my eyes meet yours, or if you are joining us online, to add their name to the chat. We think of all of them and ask for God's healing presence to be with each one of them. We also ask God to be with victims of violence around the world, granting them healing of body, spirit, and soul. And we ask God to watch over those who care for the sick each day. May they be blessed with strength and love, hope and health and support, as we ask for God's healing presence to be with each one of them that we have named and we have thought of, with each one of us, as we sing together this prayer on page 371.
May the source of strength, who bless the ones before us, help us find the courage to make our lives a blessing, and let us say, Amen. Shebeba Timote Egor Abraham Beavote. Bless those that need of you. Regret Ruach Shalema. The renewal of body, the renewal of spirit. And let us say, Amen.
This past Sunday, in my confirmation class with our 10th grade students, we spent some time discussing Holocaust education and what they had or had not learned in school. It was very minimal. It was very scary to hear how minimal it was. Many times in Shabbat services, many of you have heard me introduce the Mitanocha with something along the lines of the statement that as those who have experienced slavery, we need to work for everyone's freedom until, and no one is free until all of us are free. The same thing is true coming out of the Holocaust as those who are survivors, the children, grandchildren of survivors, and as a people who are survivors. We know what it is to be oppressed, and it is incumbent on us to work for the day where that oppression and hatred and destruction never happens again. And so in this week where we mark Yom HaShoah, Holocaust Remembrance Day, it is my privilege and my honor to welcome my teacher, Professor Simo Schwaber, to be our teacher this evening here at CDT. Professor Schwaber is the Michael and Judy Goodman Professor of Education and Jewish Studies at the University of Wisconsin in Madison, where she has conducted research and taught classes for over 20 years. She holds a bachelor's with high honors from Swarthmore College in Pennsylvania, a combined master's and PhD in education with a minor in social psychology and Jewish studies from Stanford University, and for the last 2 years has been working toward her LMFT at Edgewood College. Before becoming a professor, she served as a teacher and principal in Jewish schools in and around the San Francisco Bay Area. And since coming to UW-Madison, she has trained pre-service teachers to teach social studies in public elementary and middle schools, offered professional development opportunities to in-service teachers on a wide range of social studies topics, and worked closely with museums and international organizations to help improve exhibits, curricula, and professional development. Her research has focused primarily on how people teach and learn about the Holocaust and genocide in both formal educational realms like schools and informal educational spaces like museums and experiential trips. She has served as the principal investigator on a broad range of projects, including how the Holocaust is taught to young children, how the Holocaust is taught in fundamentalist Christian and ultra-Orthodox Jewish schools, and how it is presented to public high school students. She has served as the chair of the Jewish Studies Department at the UW-Madison and the chair of the elementary education area. Since 2016, she has served on the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum's Education Council. She's the author of numerous books and articles, including Teaching the Holocaust, a textbook for teaching about the Holocaust in Jewish schools, of which I am honored to have played an extremely minor role in reading a draft as part of my final project for her class, which she gave me an A for. Tonight, she will speak to us on the topic of what Yom HaShoah can mean this year, the importance of Holocaust education for the moment we're in. So please join me as we bring her up on the screen and welcoming via Zoom my teacher, my friend, Professor Simo Schwaber.
Can you hear me okay?
Hold on 1 second, Simon. We're just putting you. We can hear you. We just can't see you yet.
Yep,
There we
no
go.
problem.
Now we can see you.
Well, hi. It's funny when you speak on Zoom because I can't see you even though you can see me, but I'm so honored to be here. I'm really so honored for a whole variety of reasons. For starters, it's just nice to be with a congregation that says woo during Vishamru. So thank you for that. And thank you to Rabbi Ottenstein for this opportunity. It's really something I don't get to do very much because the University of Wisconsin-Madison is not a Jewish institution. I don't get to speak in a Jewish register that much. So it's really a treat for me. And then I just want to tell you something else, which is kind of funny about being a professor for years and years and years, which is that most of my students are like 18 to 22 years old. And every year they're 18 to 22 years old. And so even though I'm getting older, they basically stay the same age. And then when Rabbi Ottenstein contacted me, I was like, oh, right, of course. He's grown up since he was 18 to 22 years old. So it's really just a treat to see his congregation too. So in all these ways, I just want to say thank you for being here. And here's what else I'll say. Because I don't get to do this kind of thing very much, if what I say doesn't make sense or doesn't work, I can promise you that I'll tell you a good story at the end. So no matter what, I'll tell you a good story at the end. So I'm just going to start by talking a little bit about this week's portion, Achrimot, because the portion begins with the very somber rituals around Yom Kippur, and it ends with this really weighty discussion of all the things you're not supposed to do sexually. And in between the beginning and the end of the Parsha, there's this very famous pasuk that I've always liked, and it says in Hebrew, "Ushmartem et chukotai ve'et mishpatai, asher ya'aseh otam ha'adam v'chai bahem." So in English, that's roughly translated as, "You shall keep my laws and my rules, and by the pursuit of those laws and rules, by following them, human beings shall live." And even more specifically, it says like v'chai bahem. Literally, you can translate that as people or man shall live by them, but you can also translate that very literally as v'chai bahem, in them, like humans shall live in the laws and the rules. So that pasuk, that passage, comes after God tells Moshe to speak to the Israelites and to tell them that they shouldn't be copying the practices of the Egyptians, which is where they were coming from, and that they shouldn't follow the Canaanite laws, which is the land where they were going to. They should only follow God's laws, and that's what it means to be an Israelite. So in other words, by following God's laws, by being Israelites, they would live. And they would live as Israelites. So many rabbis in the Talmud ask, well, why in this pasuk does it say you have to obey chukotai and mishpatai? Why do you have to have both laws and ordinances, or laws and rules, however you translate them exactly? Well, some rabbis have argued that the two sets, they really refer to the laws of this world and the rules of the world to come. So that if we're following all of the mitzvot in this life, the Israelites were being promised life beyond this one. They're being promised rewards. So they would live is both a promise and a reward. It's a promise and a reward, and it's a condition of being rewarded. So first off, here's this idea. We have this idea that the ancient Israelites are being told not to live in the past, the land of the Egyptians, the land of enslavement, that land of narrowness, of closed-in spaces, that land of a closed imagination of whom they could become because they're slaves. And they're also not supposed to live in the land of the future, the land of the Canaanites. They're not supposed to be like the Canaanites among whom they're going to live. Instead, they're supposed to be separate. They're supposed to be other. They're supposed to be a people apart. So if instead of interpreting that pasuk that comes before the one that we're going to talk about a little bit more, if instead of thinking about that geographically, like not in Egypt and not in Canaan, but we think about it in terms of time and the metaphor of what it means to be an Israelite, then there's a way in which that pasuk is saying that what God is telling the people of Israel is to be neither enslaved to their past or enslaved as they were in the past, but also not to be beholden to their future, not to be, not to be among the Canaanites as though that is their future, even though that's where they were going to live. So in some ways, you can interpret the pasuk as inviting the Israelites to live in the present, to have the moral courage to be different, not to succumb to those around them just because that's who's around them, but instead to be Israelites with all that entails. And what that entails in this pasuk, in the pasuk that follows, is that to be an Israelite is to follow the rules and commandments, to follow the mitzvot. So now let's look at that pasuk a little bit. If we focus on that beautiful and powerful emphasis, v'chai bahem, and we'll live by them, to live by them, we can ask, what does it mean to live in them, in those laws? What does it mean to live by them? Does it mean that the Israelites were going to be surrounded by them, insulated by them, warmed by them, protected by them, at one and the same time, proclaimed other through them, and perhaps maybe even also slightly endangered by that difference, by that distinctiveness, not from God, of course, but by those among whom they live who are going to be a little bit threatened by difference? Well, many of the Talmud scholars interpret those words, v'chai bahem, It's like, I don't know. I don't actually know how to count them. Like v'chai bahem, maybe 3 words, maybe it's 2 words because like ve is and it's connected. Anyway, many of the Talmudic scholars, they focus on what it means to live by those commandments rather than to not live by them. So they interpret that emphasis as meaning that virtually no mitzvah, no law, no ordinance should ever be more important than our lives. So in other words, if we're asked to break a law, even on pain of death, so even if somebody is, God forbid, holding a gun up to our heads and saying, you must do this or I'll kill you, we're not to choose death. We can break any Jewish law in order to save our lives because we are meant to choose life. We are meant to live by these laws, not to die on behalf of them, not to forfeit our lives for them. So in other words, in this pasuk, we're told that the rules and ordinances are just to live by. They're not to die for. The aim of the mitzvot, of the Torah, even of God's relationship to humans, is to be our lives. We are to live not at any cost, but we're not to forfeit our lives for the laws of the Torah. And there are just a few exceptions. So the exceptions, interestingly, are that we're not supposed to publicly commit murder. We're not supposed to publicly exercise idolatry, worship idols. And we're not supposed to publicly do anything that's sexually prohibited. And as a side note, I've always been interested in this little moment where, we're not supposed to do those things publicly. So in other words, it's worth making sure that we know that the public part of those exceptions is really important. We're actually supposed to give up our lives if we're threatened with death when we're being asked to commit murder publicly, but not privately. Or we're being asked to pray to idols publicly, but not privately, or to enact prohibited sexual relations publicly. So that's largely because we're meant to be seen as good people. We're meant to be choosing the good, doing the good. And it's the public aspect of doing horrible things, even under threat of death, that matters. So when we do something that's awful, but we do it publicly in the sight of others, it's no longer just our own avera. It's no longer our own sin. It's no longer only sort of our own failing, but it's a communal failing because it could lead others to question what's good. It could lead others to follow us. It could lead others to do terrible things too. So even at pain of death, there are times when we're supposed to give up our lives in order to follow those chukotai, mishpatai, the rules and ordinances, because we're not allowed to be individual actors preserving our own lives, even under the threat of death, when we're going to sacrifice something about our community. We're ultimately communal, we're social, we're Jewishly woven into the very dense fabric of what it means to be humane, not only human. So asher ya'aseh otam ha'adam, what it means to be following these laws is as people. V'chai bahem, we're supposed to live by them, and we're only supposed to die by them if we're giving up our communal obligations. So here's a quick recap for where we are so far. If the first idea is that we're not supposed to live in the past or the future, but we're really supposed to live in the present to the best of our abilities, because we're not supposed to be like, among the Egyptians, like the Egyptians enslaved, and we're not supposed to be like the Canaanites who are idol worshipers. We're supposed to live in the present as much as we can. And if the second idea is this, we have this idea that we're fundamentally supposed to live by these laws and rules and agreements. We're not supposed to die by them. We're meant to choose life. We're meant to live by them, except in these very few exceptions when we are supposed to die by them. And the implication is that we are always and forever communally bound to each other, and that really, really matters as Jews. Well, I want to make just a third point before I turn to what I promised I would actually talk about, which is Holocaust education. The third point I just want to turn to comes from Chassidut, from the Chassidim, and they just have a slightly different take on the same pasuk, and I like it. I happen to be a fan of the Sfat Emet, who was who was a Hasidic sage, a wise man who lived from like the late 19th century, or the mid 19th century, 1847 to 1905. And he's called the Sfat Emet because that was the title of his main work. And he was the leader of the Gerer Hasidim. Well, in Hasidic thought, among Hasids, the emphasis of this pasuk that we've been talking about is on living, but it's not just being alive that matters to them. It's the way that you enact the mitzvot and follow the commandments, because by doing that, by living with the commandments, following the commandments, you're connecting with chayut, which the Hasidim consider the eternal life force. It's never ending. It's always operating. It's in us. It operates through us. It connects us. It's our connection to God. So the Sfat Emet, he has this nice turn of phrase in Hebrew where he says, tselem pnimi matters here. And tselem pnimi, you might recognize that word, b'tselem Elohim, we're all made in the image of God. But tselem pnimi here means, pnimi roughly translates as inner, and it's like our inner soul, our inner self, our what's inside of us, bifnim in modern Hebrew. It's like our inner being. And what he's saying is that he's connecting this pasuk and saying that to live by these mitzvot is to be connected to God's image. It is to be connected to the pasuk in Breshit in Genesis. And so here he's connecting image for us, our inner sense of ourselves. That image is connected to our imagination. It's like our image of ourselves and our image of what we can be is connected to consider, what kind of world we can imagine. And it's not an enslaved world. It's not a narrow world. It's not a world where we're closed or closed off from each other. It's a world that we can make bigger, tolerant, more wholehearted in connecting with each other, even when we are radically different. And we make that world come to fruition. We bring that world into this world, not only by imagining it, by acting towards it. So that Hebrew word for setting something right is mitkanim. It's from the verb litaken, like tikkun olam. It's the same word we think of for righting the world, repairing the world. Well, for the Hasidim in general, and for the Sfat Emet in particular, mitzvot are a structure or a framework for our inner repair work. And by doing that inner repair work, we make this world more like Gan Eden, more like the Garden of Eden, more like the world that's holy and closer to God, more like the world we want to be. So basically, in some sense, by following God's mitzvot, by acting ethically, we don't just survive, we live, and we try to live life to its fullest. We connect with immortality for the Hasidim, with the eternal unfolding of being, with chayut, with what it means to live in a world that's godly. And so the aim for the Hasidim isn't just to live by these laws, but be repaired by them and repair the world by them. And in those ways, we make life holy, not just for ourselves, but for each other. There's a really nice passage in which the Sfat Emet talks about how sometimes in particularly constricted places, sometimes the act of living itself is holy, given that we're meant to live. We're supposed to live by these mitzvot, but sometimes what we can do is just live. So even if in freedom, where thankfully most of us live, even with freedom, we can choose holiness. Sometimes in places or contexts where we're really constrained, where we're really shut down, closed-minded, struggling to survive. Even if we're not struggling physically, we might be struggling psychologically. Well, survival in those times and those places, just survival itself is holy. Survival itself is enough. And I think that message is particularly relevant at this moment historically, when even if we have enough food to eat, we might be terribly anxious about those who don't. And even if we aren't at war ourselves, we might fear new and enormous conflicts brewing, or we might be thinking about our friends elsewhere in the world who are living among terrible conflicts. And even if we're lucky enough to have heating in the winter and cooling in the summer, we can't help but be scared for the warming of the earth. And whether we live insulated from all kinds of violence, and whether we live right in them sometimes, we can't help, I think, and we shouldn't help, but be concerned, deeply concerned for the racialized hierarchies that make some of our lives easier and some of our lives unnecessarily hard. So sometimes we can live in really constricted places of the mind and heart, and the mitzvah is just to get through them until we have enough to rally, to continue, to get back to the work of tikkun, which we can do after we've repaired our own souls and healed enough to give back. So here are 3 big ideas. And then I promise I'm going to talk about Holocaust education, but here are 3 ideas that come from this pasuk, from this parsha. The first is the idea of not living in the past or the future, but aiming to balance those two by living in the present to the best of our abilities, trying not to be stuck in the closed places of our past, trying not to assume we know what the future is, but to try to repair the present. That's one idea. The idea that we're meant to live by mitzvot, not die by them. And given the exceptions for when we are supposed to die by them, the implication, the really important part of being a Jew is that we are always and forever communally bound to each other as Jews. And third, this Hasidic notion, this Hasidic idea that in whatever we call God, whether it's God or holiness or the experience of deep love, whatever God is for us, that we are connected to holiness because the mitzvot are a blueprint for our inner selves, our inner repair work that also helps repair the world, so that by the way we live, we help bring the world back to a place of holiness. Okay, so what does this have to do with the Holocaust? And what I'm not going to do is talk about how it's connected to the Holocaust in particular. I'm going to talk about how it's connected to Holocaust education. Oy, sorry, that's my son calling from downstairs. He doesn't matter. He tore his ACL this week, so we might call back. So sorry about that. So here's what I want to talk about just for another few minutes, which is about Holocaust education. So if we return to that idea of not living in the past, living in the future, not in Egypt, not in Canaan, but being a people apart, I translate that to an injunction that Holocaust education needs to be useful to us in the present. It has to be meaningful in our present, in the world we live in right now. And it may be strange to consider this, but that's been an ongoing debate within the world of scholars of Holocaust studies for decades. Whether the Holocaust has lessons to teach, whether it's okay to draw parallels to the history of the Holocaust, whether it stands outside of history in some way. We don't have to go down the rabbit hole of what that means, but because I've worked in Holocaust education and done research on Holocaust education for all of my career, I've always believed, and I'm really happy to report that lots of people have now moved into this position, which is that Holocaust education has to serve us. It has to teach us. Of course, it's unique in some ways, but it's also universal in some ways, like all difficult history, like all genocidal histories, all large scale and sometimes even very small scale violence. But the point of education is to teach us, to grow us, to help us move beyond our boundaries. And so it doesn't mean that we should be making easy comparisons to the Holocaust. It doesn't mean that everything that offends us is a Holocaust. It means that Holocaust education is a rightful place to make careful, considered, thoughtful, meaningful judgments about what it is we're living through in a complex and confusing world. What are the ways in which our world is in desperate need of change and growth? And what are the ways in which mass murder is fundamentally a part of what we may be experiencing, but it's not a part of what some folks in the world are experiencing. So not living in the past or the future, for me, translates into Holocaust education as Holocaust education needs to be about our present. It needs to be meaningful. It needs to be powerful. And I've seen amazing teachers do amazing things to make it so. On that second point, that was that point about living as a Jew is the point, not dying by the laws, but living. The point of the laws, the point of the mitzvot is to live. In terms of Holocaust education, I think of this as telling us in some ways not to center Holocaust education around only mass murder, not to make Holocaust education only about mass death. We need to learn, of course, about it. We need to learn from it, but we don't need to live in it. Being a Jew can be connected to the Holocaust. Of course it is. And my father, I'm a second generation is what we would call it. My father was a Holocaust survivor. So I'm not going to say Holocaust education is important. Of course it is. But being a Jew is so much bigger than the Holocaust. So Holocaust education is ideally a part of Jewish education, but it shouldn't be all of Jewish education, right? Holocaust education ideally needs to cast a really broad net and capture all kinds of meanings and the multiple legacies of the Holocaust. And it necessarily includes death, but it shouldn't gloss over the lives Jews lived before. It shouldn't ignore the amazing lives Jews lived afterwards. And of course, Jewish education has to be bigger than that. Jewish education has to be about Judaism, Jewishness, Jews, the chukim and mishpatim, in addition to the ways in which history has smashed those different people's differences. So even as we are right now living in a time when anti-Semitism is shockingly commonplace, and it's becoming more so, and where my own kids in the Midwest, when I asked them about their experiences of anti-Semitism growing up here where they did, they told me about kids throwing pennies down as though, which was surprising to me, even though I study this. But even while we're in this moment where anti-Semitism is not a minor threat, being Jewish has always exceeded the Holocaust. And so Jewish education can't rely on the Holocaust to define Jewish identity. It has to be bigger than that. That's not a new idea. It's just an important one. And then connected to that third idea, I'll just say that Hasidic idea that we are connected to holiness when we repair ourselves and repair our world. I'll just say that I think Holocaust education always needs to be connected and always has lessons for repairing the world, and not in some flimsy way, not in a flimsy way. I don't know. I don't need to go on a great length about that, but in a really powerful way, in a really profound way of what it means to struggle to make the world better, what it means to do that work not alone, never alone, and how Holocaust education can very much repair the very broken world that is our present. So I don't know if any of that makes sense. I hope it does. If it doesn't, I'm just going to end with this story because it's a good story, I think. It's the story of my grandmother. And I will just start by telling you that my grandmother, after my grandfather died, she moved to Israel and she lived in Jerusalem. And I used to go visit her with my father. And I was very lucky because we would go as frequently as we could. And when I was about 15, which tells you that this was a very different time period, because I think nowadays you wouldn't send your 15-year-old from Boston, Massachusetts to Jerusalem, with on their own, but maybe you would. Anyway, I remember this time when I was 14 or 15 and I flew to Israel and I took a bus and I made it to Jerusalem and I showed up on my grandmother's doorstep and I rang the doorbell. And I had my knapsack and I was a little schleppy looking and I was probably smelled a little. I'd flown all night. My grandmother opened the door and she looked at me and she had a very heavy accent. And she said, and I actually look a little bit like her. She said, "Ding, Simon." You don't show up without flowers. And she closed the door, and I'll never forget this. Like, I had to go, like with my backpack, I had to schlep around and find a bank and change money, and then wait till the flower shop had opened and find the flower shop, buy the flowers with the money, come back to my grandmother's apartment, knock on the door again, and stand there with a bouquet of flowers. And when she opened the door again and she saw that I had flowers, she's like, oh, okay, you can come in. So how does that have anything to do with what we're talking about? I'll tell you. For my grandmother and my father grew up in France, and my grandmother, my grandfather, and his sister, my aunt. And when the Nazis invaded in the northern part of France, in Strasbourg, where they lived, they fled. And they fled to Vichy, the southern part of France. And my father was arrested by French police. And he was put in a French camp called Gours. And my grandmother heard that my father had been arrested. And he had been arrested also with his very best friend, his first cousin, who was also his chavruta partner. So it was the partner where he went to yeshiva every day. And the two of them every day would study Talmud and Mishnah and Torah together as partners. So they were very, very close. They were the same age. So my father and Umach were arrested on the same day. And when my grandmother heard about it, because my father didn't come home that night, my grandmother, who was wealthy at the time, their whole family was wealthy at the time. My grandmother went dressed to the nines, dressed impeccably. And she spoke perfect French and she spoke perfect German because she had been raised in an orphanage. Her mother had died in childbirth. She was from Poland, but she had been raised in a French orphanage. Anyway, on that day, she goes to the concentration camp, and she's beautifully dressed, and she has a bouquet of flowers for the Gestapo. And she comes in with a wad of money, and she says, I want this Jew, meaning her son, my father, and I want this Jew, meaning his first cousin, and I want these Jews who were also arrested at the same time. And she said, and how much more money, how many more Jews can I buy out with this wad of cash, which was all the cash she had? And in that moment, I assume there was some haggling. I don't know. My grandmother never liked to talk about this, but she was able to buy out 27 Jews she didn't know, and my father. And so when my father was rounded up from the camp, not rounded up in Vichy, but when he came to the camp exit, it was his job to go get Umach, his first cousin, his best friend, his study partner, and he couldn't find them. So it might have been that it was a big camp. He was just somewhere else, but he couldn't find him in the time that he needed. So Umach was shipped off later and wasn't released when my grandmother bought out this group, but my father was. Well, my grandmother, I'll just tell you. So of course, now you understand why she thought it was always so important. If you're going to show up, you show up with flowers, and you better do your best at showing up because it mattered. But here's an interesting thing. You might think that that's an example of her living in the past. But if you ever asked her, whom did she blame for the incredible turn in her life, right? They never went back to their homes in Strasbourg. They lost family. They managed to get out of France. They managed to get to a displaced persons camp in Cuba where they lived for a few years. They managed to get to New York. They started all over. If you ever asked her, did she hate the Nazis? Did she blame the Nazis? She would always just say exactly the same. She would say, Eding, Simon, I blame circumstance. I blame circumstance. I don't blame people. And I would say she thought that because it didn't serve her in the present to live in the bitterness of her past experience. And it didn't build a future of joyful life. It didn't allow her to live b'chai bahem. It didn't allow her to live in the present. And I'm very lucky because my father, even though honestly he felt very, very guilty, He didn't talk about it much, but he did once tell me that there wasn't a day in his life that went by that he didn't feel terribly guilty for not being able to find Umach, his cousin. And that's who I'm named after. I'm named after Umach. You can't. Nonetheless, what he tried to do in his life, my father, was to build a life of joy, of gratitude, to struggle to be the best human he could be, to live by the Jewish laws and rules, not the ones he had grown up with exactly, but in the way that made sense in his presence, in his present, and to try to leave this world better for having lived in it. So I hope you don't mind me talking about both those people. We're very close in the year to my father's yahrzeit, so he's on my mind. But honestly, I'll just leave you with this. That's what I wish for all of us in these very complex and very confusing times, where sometimes the specter of the Holocaust looms large, and sometimes we may feel visited by it in ways that we don't invite it. But my hope for all of us is to keep not only laws and rules, but to do what we can to remember that those laws and rules are meant to keep life sacred, so that to live as Jews, to remember to remain part and parcel of our communities, aware of our incredible strength and the importance of our very, very key communal lives as Jews, that's what allows us to work actively, to work hard, and to make the legacies of all horrors meaningful in the present, to blame circumstance rather than each other whenever we have the choice, and to find and create joy in a world that's very rife with difficulty. And so on that note, I wish you all a Shabbat Shalom.
So to all of those blessings, all those teachings, the hope that you've shared with us, we all say amen. Simon, thank you so much for your Torah tonight, for teaching us. It was wonderful to learn with you and from you again after so many years. And, thank you for all the way from Madtown joining our community. It's just been lovely to have you here tonight. So thank you very much. As we reflect on what Professor Schwaber taught us, and thinking about using the past to inform us, but living in the moment, living in present, and living within the mitzvot, I'd like to ask us all to rise as we open the ark, and I'd like to invite Jason Rothenberg to come to the video. Jason, within this scroll, this Torah scroll, handed down by Moses from God on Mount Sinai to our people, is the secret of our people's life. It carries the laws and the precepts, the ordinances, the stories, the history, the values that we pass down from generation to generation. But this Torah that you take in your arms, that we are going to give you tonight to hold as a community, is a special Torah because it draws on this past that we are referring to tonight. It is a witness to the Holocaust. This scroll comes from Lositz, Czechoslovakia, a town that its Jewish community is no more, with this scroll being its only survivor. So as we put this Torah in your arms, we hope that it will inspire you to be a witness as well, to live in the moment, to have your life informed by the laws, the mitzvot, the precepts and the ordinances within it. And may you take them upon your heart and take them out into the world to join the Jewish people in our calling to be that light unto the nation. I ask you to take this Torah now. And as you hold this scroll, we all place our arms over Jason as we ask for God's blessing on this Shabbat, on the occasion of him becoming a bar mitzvah.
Yivarechecha Adonai v'yishmerecha.
May God bless you and keep you safe.
Yair Adonai panav elecha v'yichunecha.
May the light of God's smiling presence shine upon you and be kind and loving to you.
Yisadonai, Yisadonai, Hanavelecha, V'yasem lecha, Shalom.
And may God always bless you with the most precious of all gifts, the gifts of shalom, of health and happiness, joy and peace. As together we all say, Amen. We remain standing as we turn in our prayer books to page 586 for Arim.
Shabeach ladon hakol, latet gedula liotze bereshit, shehu notesh shamayim beyotze daharetz, umoshav yikaro bashamayim mima'al, ushchinatu zo begove meromim, hu Eloheinu einod, anachnu koreim, umishtachavim umodim, lifnei melech malchei hamlachim, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, V'nemar V'aya Adonai, L'melech al kol haaretz, Bayom hahu, Yeh Adonai echad, U'shemo echad.
As we prepare to turn to Kaddish, we first turn to prayers of memory, prayers and psalms, recalling the Shoah, recalling the Holocaust of which Yom HaShoah this week and this Shabbat has brought to the forefront in our collective minds. Page 525. In the presence of eyes which witnessed the slaughter, which saw the oppression the heart could not bear, and has witnessed the heart that once taught compassion until the days came to pass that crushed human feeling, I have taken an oath to remember it all, to remember, not once to forget. Forget not one thing to the last generation, when degradation shall cease to the last to its ending, when the rod of instruction shall have come to conclusion. An oath, not in vain passed over the night of terror. An oath, no morning shall see me at flesh pots again. An oath, lest from this we learned nothing. Page 529. I believe in the sun, even when it's not shining. I believe in love, even when feeling it not. I believe in God, even when God is silent. On page 530, we rise for El Male Rachamim.
Il male rachamim, shochen bamromim. Amtse menuka nekona, tacha kafe ashtina. B'malot kedoshim utovim, kizor aki amazirim. Et nishmot 6 million achenu ve'achiotenu. שנהרגו על קידוש השם. ברחמים יסירם, בצדק כנפיו לעולמים, לצרור ביטוח חיים את נשמתם. אדוני הוא נחלתם, ואנוכו לשלום על משכבם, ונאמר אמן.
Holy, compassionate God on high, for our 6 million brothers and sisters murdered because they were Jews, grant clear and certain rest with you in the lofty heights of the sacred and pure, whose brightness shines like the very glow of heaven. Source of mercy, forever enfold them in the embrace of your wings. Secure their souls in eternity. Adonai, they are yours. They will rest in peace. Amen. At this sacred moment of our Shabbat evening worship, as we recall all of the victims of the Holocaust, the victims of hatred and terror and destruction, we also remember those who have been taken from us both recently and at this season in years past. We are in a period of Shiva, the first 7 days since her funeral of Sylvia Kirsch. And we mark the yardside, the anniversary of their passing on this Shabbat, of Abraham Allman, Lily Altberger, Hilda Danzig, Karen Finkelstein, Jerry Haber, Molly Levine, Al Siegel, Inez Toney, Elise Finley Toney, and Phyllis Willendrick. If you are remembering someone on this Shabbat, I invite you to share their name with the community as my eyes meet yours, or to add their name at this time to the chat. Zikronam Livracha, that all of their memories be a blessing. And that we take all of their memories into our hearts as we raise our voices together in Israel's supreme prayer of faith, the words of the Kaddish on page 598. Yitgadal v'yitgadat shemei Rabbah, v'yalmad yivrach v'rutei v'yamlik malchutei, v'chayechon v'yomechon v'chayeh d'chol beit Yisrael, v'agala v'zman kari v'imru amen. Yehei shmei Rabbah mevorach le'olam v'amei omaya. Yitbarach v'yishtabach v'yitpa'ar v'yitromam v'yitnaseh. V'yitadar v'yitaleh v'yitalal shmei d'kedusha b'richu. Le'elam min kol birchata v'shirata. Tushbachata v'netamata. Dami ran v'alma v'imru amen. Yehei shlama Rabbah min shemaya. V'chayim aleinu v'al kol Yisrael v'imru amen. Oseh shalom v'roma. Huya aseh shalom. Aleinu v'al kol Yisrael v'imru amen. 653.
Eli, Shelo yigamer leolam, Achol v'hayam, Rishu shel hamayim, Berak hashamayim, Tzilat Adam, Achol v'hayam, Rishu shel hamayim, Berak hashamayim, Tzilat Adam. O God, my God, I pray that these things never end. The sand and the sea, the rush of the waters, the crash of the heavens, the prayer of the heart, the sand and the sea, the rush of the waters, the crash of the heavens, the prayer of the heart.
Please be seated. Good Shabbos, everyone.
Shabbos.
Once again, I want to thank my teacher, Professor Simo Schwaber, for her words of Torah, for teaching us this evening. As we prepare to conclude our service, just a few brief announcements before our Kiddush and Motzi, and we can all then go have what I hear is a phenomenal Shabbat, in honor of Shabbat and in honor of Jason's bar mitzvah this weekend. Just a few announcements though. This Sunday is our last day of religious school this year. Please join us. Everyone's invited to join us at 10:45 for our closing ceremonies as we will celebrate our kids finishing up another year and thank our teachers and our mother team for all of their hard work, and we will say farewell officially to Molly in her role as Director of Education and wish her luck in her next chapter. So we hope to see you at 10:45. Weather permitting, we will be on the field outside, and then following religious school, have a falafel lunch on the patio. And if I will probably be inside because it looks like rain. And so if it is, we'll be inside for it, the ceremony here in the sanctuary and lunch in the social hall. So please join us 10:45 this Sunday. Moving into next week, our adult and Mitzvah Hebrew class meets on Monday at 6:45, and Sisterhood Book Club is at 7:30 p.m. On Wednesday, we will continue studying the book of Joshua in our Tanakh study group. And on Thursday, our knitting and crochet group will meet at 1 p.m. on Zoom. And next Friday evening on May 6th, join us as we will celebrate our confirmation students, our 10th graders. So Kobe, you're coming back next week. But our 10th graders, as they celebrate their official final day of their formal religious school education, and they will lead us in prayer and confirm who they are as members of the Jewish people during that meaningful service. There's a lot more coming up in the next few weeks, especially as we head to Shavuot, the beginning of June, which we will celebrate with the Reformed communities of the North Metro area, Temple Emmanuel, Temple Kilat Chaim, Temple Beth Tikva, and Temple Kol Emeth. Will join us here at CBT on June 4th for Shavuot. So I hope to see you all then as we welcome Shavuot and celebrate receiving Torah with a Tikkun Leil Shavuot, a late evening of study together with the rabbis and cantors and soloists of the many Reformed congregations in the North Metro area. As we do each week, we want to thank people who have given to our synagogue in various ways. And this week, to both of you who are here, to Sherry Nemiroff and Richard Cohn, for all the work you both do each and every week, because our own eggs are beautiful and they're back to normal, and it's wonderful to be able to have a cookie again and some fruit as opposed to a bag of chips. So, and a Twinkie. So thank you both for all the hard work you do, so we can celebrate Shabbat with joy, continue celebrating with joy after our services each week. Finally, before Kiddush and Motzi, Jason is celebrating a simcha this weekend, becoming a bar mitzvah. And Jason, there's going to be a lot of people tonight, tomorrow, who want to wish you mazel tov. You're probably going to get some gifts this weekend, but we want the first gifts, the first words of mazel tov, to come from your congregation and your community. So I'm going to ask you to come up one more time. This is the last time tonight, I promise. But we're also going to ask your grandma Ruthie to come up so that she, not only in her role as your grandma, but on behalf of the congregation, can wish you mazel tov and give you some gifts.
This will be very brief because we all really want to go to that MA. It's prime. You, my darling, portrait number 4 out of 5. We have some gifts for you, which you may or may not appreciate right away, but you will. Okay. First we have from Sisterhood, and I put that first because after all, it's Sisterhood. You have in here a tzedakah box, and you know what to do with the tzedakah box. And more important, you know what to do about tzedakah. It doesn't mean just change that you put in your box every week, but it means giving of yourself and your own goodness. And you have, look at me. Okay. Only a grandson could do this. Later. All right, he's out of control. Okay. Next, we have a book. I know you will not read this now. It's not on the top list of things, and it's not in graphics. So it's called the Bible, the Bible, and it's very interesting. It has good stories in there, a little bit violent sometimes, but it's really good reading. And I would say in a year or so, you might, although I don't know with the others if they have started, but I did at 14. I took it out and I started reading it, and I got a little bit tired when everybody begat everybody. But then I clicked ahead and I got into it. So this is a book that's with me forever and ever. And there are 4 things. But one we can't get to tomorrow, and that's your bar mitzvah certificate, so I refuse to give that to you today. I know. Get over it. And we have here, yes, this is the certificate from, thank you, I have a terrible time with that, the Union for Reform Judaism. They give a $250 gift towards a trip to Israel. Unfortunately, it's not going to be the trip I'm taking you and your cousin on. I don't get this, but you do for another trip. You cannot spend it on a trip now. So this is all from you have a very large and loving family. And you have the temple, as you know, is our 3rd home, right? We have their home on Wither Ridge. We have my home on Donington, and we have this home on Parsons. So I wish you mazel tov.
Jason needs to stay up here, but you can go back to your seat because Jason's going to help us with Kiddush and Motzi as we all turn to page 123. And we ask the congregation to please rise.
Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam borei peri agafen. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'ratzavanu v'shabbat kodsho v'ahava u'ratzon hinchilanu zikaron l'maaseh b'reishit ki hu yom tehila l'mikra'ei kodesh zecher l'siyat mitzrayim Kivanu v'acharta v'otanu kidashta mikol ha'amim v'shabbat kodshecha b'yava u'v'ratzon hinchaltanu Baruch atah Adonai mekadesh haShabbat. L'chaim.
Jason, I'll take that. And you uncover the challah. Cover it first. Take the cover up, and now you can take it. As we sing together.
Motzi lechem min haaretz. We give thanks to God for bread. Our voices rise in song together as our joyful prayer is said. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam. Motzi lechem min haaretz.
And as he has the first bite on behalf of all of us, we ask for God's blessing. Adonai Oz le'amo yitein, Adonai yivarech et amo v'yekol v'nei adam b'shalom. May God give strength to our people, and may God bless all of us, all of Israel and all creation with the blessing of peace. Because together we all say, Amen. Shabbat Shalom.